Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's just after 1, and I wanted to just take a second to thank everybody for attending. This is a training session for agencies to help them use federal highway funds on their projects, and we are really grateful to have the support today from Diane Sheesley and Ruth McIntyre of TranTech Engineering. They developed a training program for local agencies through the APWA Education Committee. I may have gotten that wrong, and graciously offered to reprise their training session for PRTPO and its members, and then by extension, because we had the capacity, the board wanted to offer this training to others, very aware that ours are not the only local agencies that really struggle with the burden of managing federally funded projects. We are going to, today we're going to, this is going to be about 3 hours total. We'll take a break midway through, and Diane and Ruth have broken this out into sections. So if you have questions throughout, if you would enter them into the chat log, we'll monitor those, and then at the end of each section, we'll try to recap some of those questions. Then we might interrupt here or there along the way if need be, but mostly we'll try to capture the questions at the end of each section. And then if we have time at the end, just opportunity for some more free-ranging questions and discussions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Diane and Ruth, and thank you very much. Take it away, please.
Thanks, Sarah. We appreciate it. So I see a lot of familiar names out here on the attendees. So nice to see some of you. And for those that do not know me, my name is Diane Sheesley. I've spent most of my career working for local agencies. I've been at Thurston County, City of Tacoma, and Mason County. And I have about 20 years of experience working for local agencies, and I'm kind of newer on the consultant side. But this seems to be a need that people have, and I'm not going to say that I am like the most expert person. I'm going to say there might be some questions you have today that we might need to get back to you on, because I don't work for WSDOT. We are not the people that are like coming in to do your PMRs, although Ruth has done many, many of them in her day. But having that local agency experience, hopefully we can help you with questions that you do have, and I'll let Ruth introduce herself.
Yeah. I'm Ruth McIntyre. I worked for DOT for many years myself, also for another state DOT and private companies along the way. Combined probably more years than most of you sitting here listening to it have been around. Sorry. Anyway, my most recent experience was with the headquarters local programs office in Olympia, Washington, where I worked with the training program, but also before that with the project management reviews and construction management section of the local programs office.
So, and we have a lot to cover today. This could probably be a week-long topic, like a boot camp kind of thing. So we just up front, I want to let you guys know we're going to cover as much as we can of preliminary engineering and construction. We're going to cover very little about right-of-way, but we're going to touch on it. And with that, we're just going to go ahead and get started. So an overview, these are the sections that we're going to talk about today. And as Sarah mentioned, we'll take some time for questions at the end of each section. We're going to try to keep on moving, so we may not answer all the questions as they come up. We'll take any time we have at the end to answer additional questions. And our goal today is mostly familiarity, where to look for help with particular topics. And we can't get into every detail of each item, but we'll do our best to get you all of the basic federal funding needs from inception through project closeout. So with that, we'll start with the inception part, is setting up a new project. We'll talk about how to get started and the things that you need to do to utilize federal funding, have projects in the STIP. Even you'll want to look at your local TIP before that. and before you even apply for grants, like checklists and getting your projects obligated. Oh, I'm just going to make a little adjustment on my own screen here so I can get you guys the best info. Okay, so before you even get federal funding, you want to be looking years out at your projects. You want to be looking at your 6-year TIP. If you're a city, you must adopt this document every year before July 1st. If you're a county, every year before December 31st. You can update these documents at any time. It does take time to update them. There's processes for that. If you're not the person that does this, someone at your agency does. So you can ask them how this works, depending on your council or commission process. That depends how long it takes to add projects. Most federally funded grants require that a project be on your 6-year TIP. So this is a planning document. A lot of times there are projects that you're applying for funding for, but they're not fully funded by the agency. You do not have to have a project fully funded to put it into your TIP. You can put just some planning funds, then try to go get more money and then update your TIP. You have to have a project on your TIP to add to the STIP. You also, you either need to be a regional project or have funds to add them to the STIP. And I think everybody here, we may have people with it. If you have an MPO, you go through your MPO, who then goes through WSDOT. A lot of our participants today, I do not believe, have MPOs. So you will work directly with WSDOT. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So when you're adding projects to your TIP and you're thinking out over these 6 years, you don't want to think just 1 year to 1 year. You want to think 2-3 years out because federal money takes a long time to deal with. You want to think about what types of other funds you'll have. When you have FHWA money, sometimes you want to match that with other funds. You can match federal money with federal money, but it is limited in what you can do. You can match HUD and community development block grants sometimes with FHWA. This is pretty rare. I've done it once in 20 years. I know a few other people that have done it. We did it on a sewer and water project at Thurston County. I have done where FTA and federal highway funds go together. This is really complicated as well. This is for a type of project, maybe that first last mile connector. We did this in Tacoma where we did sidewalk improvements, bike lanes, connections to transit facilities for the Link Light Rail extension. We had FTA design money, and we had federal highway funds for construction. This gets complicated because they use the same CFR, but for instance, like the Title VI language for FTA and FHWA is different. They both require you to use their language when you have their funds, but you're not going to put 2 Title VI languages in your advertisement, for example, and that kind of thing. So you need to work with your local programs people for your federal aid and with your FTA representative to determine which you will follow when they're different.
Which agency is lead agency?
Yes, which agency will lead. And you really want to think about whether you even want to add this kind of complication. If you are looking at design funds, but you don't think you can get construction funds, you might want to rethink your type of design funds. If you can keep with one type of funding for your agency, it makes things a lot simpler to not get yourself in trouble. So sometimes it's easiest just stick with one. You can match state and federal. TIB is a good example. I've done that a lot of times, but you actually lose points. You get your TIB grant application will get reduced by a point if you have federal funding. It's a checkbox on that grant application. And that's just because federal funds are difficult to work with. They take more time. TIB, they like to spend their money. State grants, they want their money spent. So you don't want to take that extra time. Bureau of Indian Affairs, Federal Lands Access Program, and IACC are other types of grants that you can get that you can match with federal highways. I'm going to let Ruth talk a little bit about IACC. After we'll just cover FEMA real quick. When there's an emergency declared by the state, you can also sometimes get a 13.5%. You can get federal funds, and then 13.5% of the 25% that's left for the agency to pay for can sometimes be paid for by the state. So those are ways that you can share money. And then Ruth.
And so the IACC, how about if you mute and I unmute?
Okay.
We had some logistics issues there. You have to turn off your speaker. Hover over the speaker. Something. Okay. Sorry, technical difficulties. The world has changed a lot. Anyway, talking about Infrastructure Assistance Coordinating Council, this is probably the best bang for your buck if you're a small agency or a rural county and you're looking for pieces of a project. This is a group of funding agencies, both state and federal. They have a conference once a year in October. I highly recommend that you, if you have need for assistance putting together a funding package, you reach out to the Infrastructure Assistance Coordinating Council. They have wonderful resources. You can go to one place and find all the money that is coming out, the kinds of grants that are going to be given, loans perhaps. Sometimes loans are a better option for you. Different things change along the way. Anyway, IACC is easy to come by. It's a link on one of our slides, I believe, and you should be able to go to their website and find contact information. And if you had any questions, you could also address them to us and we can get you the right people.
All right, thanks, Ruth. Okay, so once you've figured out what types of funding you're going to go for, what types of grants you would like, what your local agency match is, and you have a project on your tip, you can apply for your grants. If you get FHWA funding, the very first step you need to do with that funding is add a project to the STIP. So this is what a project would look like when you add a project to the STIP. This is a project. Now I see Alex here for Oak Harbor. And, you know, this takes a little time. This is going to take you, depending on when you get the information in, WSDOT updates the STIP about once a month. Nancy Huntley is a very nice lady. She is the contact with WSDOT. She's very helpful. She has some other staff that may help you out. And we've got some links here to local programs, STIP, and this will be available there. We'll have it available to everyone. Something I want to mention is that these links change frequently, but right now, when we last checked, all of these links work. So for right now, these links are good. In the future, you might need to do some searching on WSDOT's website. And then Nancy's email is here as well. And if it's ever someone different, the email address is available on WSDOT's website. So once you add a project to the STIP, then you can obligate your projects, but you're going to want to be looking at the lag manual. There's a lot of checklists that you need to fill out when you have federal funds. This is just a few of those checklists that need to be completed with projects. So there's some commonly used checklists for preliminary engineering and some commonly used checklists here for construction. And this link here goes to a PDF format of WSDOT forms. It's pretty comprehensive and you can find a lot of your resources there. So when you go to fill out your obligation packet, there are a lot of pieces that go into the packet. You're going to have your project prospectus, you're going to have your local agency agreement, you're going to have your estimate, you're going to have a map of your project. You will have a whole documented cost estimate. You, when you were doing signatures, and I don't know if that will come back after COVID, if you go back to wet signatures, you want to send extra copies of your local agency agreement so that you get an original back for your agency. If you only send one, WashDOT's going to keep that. And you have a DOT form 140553 that needs to be turned in. And you need your environmental classification summary form, which is your NEPA, signed NEPA, when you obligate your right-of-way and your construction. You won't have that yet for PE, but those are things that you'll need at right-of-way and construction. So you're going to submit this packet 3 times throughout the life of your project. Once for PE, once for right-of-way, once for construction, if you have federal funds for all 3 of those. So there's some things with this. Your description of work on your obligation packet, it needs to match on your prospectus, your local agency agreement, on everything that you fill out. You want it to match your STIP. It should probably match your agency TIP as well. It's just a really good idea that this description of work matches everywhere. The one place where it can have minor differences is on your NEPA, because your NEPA is the description as it implies for environmental, but it shouldn't be that different. It should still be very, very, very close. You want to follow the local agency guidelines for this project agreement end date and proposed advertisement date. You cannot use federal funds after this agreement end date. So when this document is signed, you're going to have council and commissioners that say, we want this built in a year. So they want this end date to be 1 year. But we all know that things happen when you're purchasing right away, things happen during construction, things even happen during design. They happen with permits, they happen when you find a wetland that you thought was just a roadside ditch. They happen when you find that there's fish in that roadside ditch that was man-made, even though you thought it wouldn't be fish bearing. So all kinds of things can make your design take longer than you think that it will take, and take longer than your council or commission wants it to take. And that is why it's really important. You can point to the local agency guidelines, and you can promise your council and commission that, hey, we are going to do all that we can do to get this out in 1 year. But when we fill out this document, it says add 3 years everywhere. It says it in all 3 places here, add 3 years. And that doesn't mean that we can't get it done early. But the reason it's important to portray this to your elected officials is because these documents, your obligation packet, needs to usually be signed by your mayor or city administrator. And that is all dependent on your CA agreement. So there are agencies here that don't have a CA agreement, so that you work that out with WashDOT as far as who signs, but usually there's some elected official involved, and they may want that end date to be sooner than later, but it's really important that you move it out as far as you can. When you get to that date that's here, you cannot get any reimbursement for federal aid. So and you cannot change that. There is a process to change it. It takes a long time to change it, and it is difficult to do. It's just recommended put that date out.
You can always finish it sooner.
Yes, there's no problem with finishing it sooner, but you can't even, like when you're doing project closeout, those things will not be eligible for reimbursement if the date has expired. It's also really important to bill right away. Once you've obligated, you do not want to end up on the inactive list, which is if you do not send a bill over 3 months' time, then you have to have a conversation with WashDOT so that they can try to keep your project active for you. So as we've talked about a little bit, there's 3 times that you obligate if you have federal money for the whole project: preliminary engineering, right-of-way, and construction. Now we're not going to talk a lot about right-of-way, but even if your project does not have right-of-way, you need to have attended this right-of-way training and education for local public agencies and consultants. So there's a link here that will take you to right-of-way training. There is other right-of-way training on the WSDOT website that is really good for all kinds of right-of-way. And then another good part of the WSDOT website is this local project search. You can find your project, you can see what it has been obligated for, dollar amounts, if it's in the PE phase, right-of-way phase, construction phase. And a lot of times it shows up on this web page before you even get your letter back in the mail that you've been obligated. And so, Thera, do we have some questions on this section?
Diane, I don't have, no questions have popped up from the group yet, but I want to ask you all, and Ruth, maybe you could weigh in on this. Brian Moorhead has stressed with me a couple of times the importance of using the checklists. And even to the point of, if there's something on the checklist that's not applicable to your project, the importance maybe even of just submitting a piece of paper that says not applicable, that they, from the inside, they really go down all those steps of the checklist. And what he's tried to impress upon me is that really our locals really need to be relying on that checklist, even to the point seemingly silly of saying, this is not applicable to my project. What do you think about that? Is that relevant, or is that a good tool, or is that overkill?
You want to mute your, okay. It is relevant, and I'm glad you brought it up, Sarah. Brian was referring to the project management review checklist, which is, by the way, a fillable PDF that's on the site that Diane just pointed out to you with all the DOT forms. You can download that and follow it yourself. And this, I don't know where she went. There we go. The forms. There we go. I highly recommend you do exactly that. And Brian's advice too, even put a piece of paper in a file, or in this case, I would put a Word, a one-page PDF in an electronic file saying does not apply, or whatever it is not applicable to this project, just so they know you didn't miss it, you addressed it. And it's just the same as writing a change order, and you have to address time on every single one of them, whether it changes time or not. They want to know you thought about it. So same deal with the checklist. They want to know you were aware and it just didn't apply, not that you missed it.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, I just encourage, and I realized earlier I said if people have questions, they can drop them in the chat. You could also use the Q&A function as well, and we'll make sure that they bubble up. So thank you very much, you guys.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a great question. Okay, so we'll move on here to working with consultants and contractors. And so there is a whole chapter, chapter 31 of the local agency guidelines for using consultants. So consultants are used in preliminary engineering, and consultant selection is based on selection criteria. And this is the selection criteria that you advertise. You need to include what you're basing your selection on in your advertisement, and you need to keep all the records for this. A&E contracts, they're qualifications based. They're not based on cost. You cannot ask about cost when you're selecting a consultant that's architecture and engineering. And that's defined in the lag manual under chapter 31. And when you have FHWA funds, you cannot use the MRSC roster. So you can subscribe to the MRSC roster and you can pull from that using your local funds. But when you have federal funds, you must have a solicitation that is individual and separate. You can't use a roster unless you have set up a roster following the local agency guidelines for chapter 31. And I know that no one in the state has done it. When I was at Tacoma, we tried to do it. It is a very cumbersome, yes, it is a long process, and the restrictions on it it's too much. you would never make it worth your while. It ends up being cheaper to just advertise for each project and go through the process, because you have to update the roster so often, and the documentation that you have to keep, it just is not worth it to have a roster for federal aid. You also can run yourself into problems because you can't use a consultant that's already on a different project. So say, for instance, like if the Parks Department hired a consultant and you didn't from the roster, and then Public Works wanted to have someone from the roster do something, like you have to be checking with all your departments when you have a roster, and it's just, you don't want to make a roster. It's a lot of work. So you want to advertise for each project, and then you must also complete your own independent cost estimate. So local programs has told me before, when they would look at mine, they're like, thank you for having it be different. They never cared. I had sometimes substantially different price because I might have thought of something that I thought we needed to do. And the consultant's like, oh, hey, we did that already on, this other project that was right up the street. We can use that information. It saves you money. Or, hey, you guys might not have thought of this, and this is in, maybe it's in your scope that we're going to build this wall. And to build that wall, we have to have this much geotech that you hadn't thought of. So that's a higher cost. And it's fine for your estimates to be different. In fact, if you didn't independently do them, if you're independently doing them, they should be a little different. So you want to do this all by yourself before you see what the consultant has put together. And then you also want to have, this is just an example of the criteria that were advertised. And then you have your point scale, and then your scores and how they add up. And you need something like this in your file. And you want to have a minimum of 3 reviewers when you are selecting a consultant. You don't want to have one person make that selection. And then, and yes, odd numbers are better. If you do, 4 people, it's hard because you can end up with ties. A 5-person panel or a 3-person panel is good. And then you'll have your scores for the SOQ and your scores for the interview. And you want to make sure in your advertisement that you've lined out how the selection will be made. Do you take your SOQs, the written piece, select the top 3, and then they start over an interview and the winner of the interview wins? Or are you adding those scores together? You want that all lined out so that there are no questions at all about who's the winner and how they are selected. So there are 2 things that we see come out a lot is RFQs and RFPs. So RFQ is for A&E contracts. You are requesting qualifications. These are qualifications-based selections. So these are covered by RCW 39.80, contracts for architectural and engineering services. So there's a link there for that RCW. You cannot ask about money when you are selecting an architect or engineer. You are selecting based on qualifications, and this is architecture, engineering, surveying, landscape architecture. It's people with professional stamps that are stamping things. For a professional service, you can ask about dollars, and this is a request for proposals. So you can say, I want 30% of the selection on a proposal to be based on the cost. You can consider cost. You don't have to. You can have all of your criteria not deal with dollars. You can have different selection criteria, but there's no reason not to include cost here. And sometimes people make it a very high percentage. So examples of this are real estate, consulting services, materials testing. But this is when you do not have the material tester do analysis for you. They are running like a sieve analysis. Yes, pass fail. You're not asking them to do calculations or stamp a report or advise you what to do with the information they're collecting for you. They're collecting information and providing it to you. Environmental planning, legal services, public engagement. These are all examples where you can ask for cost. So when you have federal money, there are only 3 types of contracts that you can use. The contracts are available here at this link, and you must use the WSDOT contract. So you go to this link here and you pick one of these contract types. The agency selects this, the consultant does not. So don't let consultants push you around or say like, oh, it'd be better if we do this by lump sum. You as an agency, you decide what type of contract. And there's cost plus fixed fee. There is a spreadsheet on how to calculate your fee percentage. You don't just go with 30% because the consultant says it should be 30%. You fill out this calculation fee percentage. It's always a good idea for the agency and the consultant to fill out their own and then see, you know, where they're close. If your consultant's saying, hey, I'm coming up with 30% and you're coming up with 25, maybe there's some room for both of you to move around, but don't just go with, you know, 35% because someone said 35%. That's like for the higher numbers are reserved for projects that have more risk, have more sub-consultants. You can see on the calculation sheet, it explains what the ranges should be. WSDOT gives you parameters to put in there. And then there's specific rates of pay. These are negotiated hourly rates. There are times when those can be updated. They can't just be updated every time someone gets a raise. I believe it's once a year. So you can't, these are for maybe a little bit smaller projects than a cost plus fixed fee. Cost plus fixed fee has the most latitude, but it's for your bigger projects. Lump sum, you really have to be very, very well defined. You probably are not using this on federal aid that often, but there is a time and place for it. It's on something that's small and, you know, the scope is, there's not a lot of change in the scope. Shouldn't be changing the scope anyway, but it's very direct. We're going to bore 3 borings and there's no way that we might need to bore a 4th. There's no way that we might be able to just have 2 and get enough information. You know exactly what you're doing and there's no way that you would change any of that. And so you cannot use any other contract. You can't use a contract that your attorney wants to use. You are using the lag contracts for these. And let's see. Oh, okay, so Ken has a question about pavement preservation. So for pavement preservation, if this is with a consultant, because we're talking about consultants here, I would probably use a cost plus fixed fee if I'm doing that contract. Ruth, you're agreeing?
I do.
Just because with pavement preservation, if you're having the consultant look at all of your road ratings, there's some latitude that's going to happen there. They're looking at all your ratings. They need to look at the actual streets. You might have some chip seal, you might have some overlay, you might have some cape seal. If you have overlays, you're going to have curb ramps. So it's not going to be...
it's not as easy to define.
Yes, that pavement preservation is actually a lot harder to define than some projects that go from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue, and you know that you are following a standard section for your agency that's going to have 2 12-foot lanes, 2 6-foot shoulders, and 2 6-foot sidewalks. It's preservation. It's
too many variables.
A lot of variables, yeah. So I would go cost plus fixed fee for that. So construction is different than consultants. You are selecting based on the lowest bid, and it's not just the lowest bid, it is the lowest responsible bidder. So you want to follow all the guidelines in the WSDOT construction manual, and you want to be fair with your contractors. Yes, there are changes that happen. I've seen where people will just give away anything on a change order. Some changes are not changes. There are things defined in the spec book that say that a contractor is on the hook for certain things, and you shouldn't be just giving away your local agency funds for those items. Then there are other things that truly are changes, and there are agencies that they want to argue everything because maybe they don't want to go back to council or their commission. So if you can work in some kind of contingency with your council or commission, or if you can work in bid items that give you some contingency, that's a very good idea. Minor changes, utilities.
That's what I was going to bring up, minor changes.
Minor changes.
Don't forget minor changes.
You can have items for utility conflict resolution, particularly if you know that you could have a conflict. Maybe you've potholed beforehand and you know that in the location you potholed, you're good for your stormwater, but maybe you don't know that your water line's in the same place, 500 feet down the road, and it is not always cost effective to pothole every 100 feet. Yeah. So you have to make good choices, and you think that you know what's going on, but maybe you throw in a utility resolution item.
Unanticipated changes.
Yes. So there's a difference between subcontractor and professional services as well. It's direct charge.
Subcontractor versus professional services direct charge. So
if you a subcontractor, you pay through your contractor, and they do work. This can be like your DBE and that percentage.
Right.
A professional service, this can be on a consultant or a contractor. They can be paid a direct charge. So in invoice. So, and this is an example on the consultant side, but it's the same with a contract. You have somebody go out that does, like, say, some traffic counts, but they don't tell you a projected level of service or anything. They just provide you a traffic count. That's a professional service. So that can just be paid as an invoice. You don't have to have an hourly wage, a fixed fee. It can be an invoice. So that's the direct charge piece of that. And if you work together as a team with your consultants and contractors, don't let them take advantage of you, but don't take advantage of them as well. They are out there on your streets with their logo on their vehicle. They look good if they do a good job, and so do you. It's really a team effort, everybody. Hopefully, I have not actually run across very many people that try to do the wrong thing in our industry. People are trying to do the right thing. There was a time in 2008, 2009, when you had a lot of, people that built roads in housing developments try to come over and do some federal aid work. It got a little crazy, but they weren't trying to do a bad job. They just were not familiar with the paperwork. The federal highway paperwork, it's a lot. And but try to work as a team, and that will make things as good as they can be. So there's this thing that's called disadvantaged business enterprise, and if you haven't had a federal highway project recently, they used to go by UDBE goals. So in November of 2020, the U went away. The U was for underutilized. The big difference is white women-owned companies are part of DBE, and they were not part of UDBE. So we had DBE like 4 or 5 years ago. It went to UDBE. It's back to DBE. This will probably change again in all of our careers.
Multiple times.
Yes, they're always doing parity studies, or it seems like they are. So this always changes just to try to keep up with the times. And this is kind of newer. It is that DBE goals, they apply to preliminary engineering and construction. There was a time when they were only for construction. And then when they became part of PE, they were for contracts over 300,000. So they were for your bigger projects. And now they're for 100,000 contracts and over. And you should be sending something to local programs for every project before you advertise, no matter the cost. But if you're under 100,000, your goal should be 0. And agencies should be expecting higher goals. So I don't know if any of you out there have received a goal lately and you thought that it was really high. The reason why is because there are more businesses that qualify as DBEs than there were UDBEs in the state. So the goals are set proportionately higher because you have a higher opportunity to meet those goals and to have DBEs on your project. So there is a place that you have to report all of this information. It's a software, it's called VMCS. There is a link here for that. And WSDOT does have some training available for this software. It gets reported monthly. You need to put all of your federal project information in. And this is making sure that you're paying your prime contractor on time and that they are paying their DBEs and really all of their sub-consultants and subcontractors on time. And part of all of this reporting, it comes from prompt payment laws, but also comes in from the perspective of commercially useful function. And commercially useful function means the performance of real and actual services that are integral and necessary in the discharge of any contractual endeavor, not solely for the purpose of obtaining certification or obtaining credit for participation goal attainment. So that's a lot. Part of what this really means is you can't have a DBE, say that's a truck driver, and then they drive a truck that's owned by the prime. The equipment needs to be owned by the DBE or rented on their own from someone to be a commercially useful function. Do you have anything to weigh in? Mm-hmm. Ruth, go ahead.
Sure. So commercially useful function would implies that they do their own ordering, they manage their own business. I'm coming over closer to the speaker here. We're sharing a room. It implies that they're actually functioning as a real contractor. There was a lot of fraud in this program in the beginning, which is why these all these forms and all the interviews and everything have to be done now, is to verify that in fact we are dealing with a truly an independent contractor and not somebody's offspring that needed a job, or a brother-in-law, or, I mean, those kinds of things did happen. Did I say that? Yes, they do. Anyway, sorry.
So thanks, Ruth. And with that, part of that is there was a lot of things that happened with trucking, where like a DBE company that might own like one truck would then hire out several other trucks, but those individual trucks were owned and operated by non-DBEs. And so that's where some of these new trucking forms have come from. Those were new in 2019. So if you haven't had a federally funded job since 2019, there are trucking forms that now need to be filled out, and there's a link here for that. And so there's a new parity study underway, which we kind of briefly mentioned before. So with that being underway, that's where we're saying you can expect that the DBE may change again. The parity study may come out that everything is exactly as it should be, and it might stay the same. We can hope for a little less changes. It makes our life easier. But we will find out here when that parity study is done. So always be looking for changes there. And I'm checking, I don't see any,
questions?
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So I was gonna look for a way to say we answered it, but I don't see one. So we'll move on to specifications. So while you're putting your project together, you'll wanna be, in design, you'll wanna be thinking about your specifications, and spec books are now updated yearly. There are no longer the front end amendments where we used to have amendments. Those are gone. WSDOT is now roping in anything that would be an amendment is now a mandatory GSP. But be very, very careful with the mandatory GSPs. because some of what shows up as a mandatory GSP under WSDOT's GSP list, those are mandatory GSPs for WSDOT. There are some APWA specifications that are written for local agencies because there are some legal differences between WSDOT and local agencies. An example of this is that WSDOT is required to pre-qualify contractors. A local agency cannot legally pre-qualify a contractor. So saying you're not allowed to do that. So you don't want to use a mandatory GSP from WSDOT that talks about pre-qualification when you as an agency are not allowed to do that. So it's really important that you take a peek at what those are and don't just throw them in. A lot of the ones now that were mandatory deal with COVID issues and your COVID plans. So those things you do need, and you want to put those in. But you also want to think about then what year of specification book you're using. So the new books now come out in September instead of December. They come out once a year instead of every 2 years. And if you want to use the book between September and December 31st, you must have approval from your local programs person when you have federal highway funds. You used to be able to use the book but from January to March as a local agency, but the new cutoff is January. So January 1st of any year, if you're advertising then, you must use the new book. So it's really important to think about this when you look at your commission or your council schedule, because a lot of times they cancel meetings between Christmas and New Year's. So if you think that you're going out in December, but, oh, my council's not meeting, well, then don't forget to change your spec book, because you're not allowed to use that spec book past December 31st now. My personal thought, this is kind of a hardship for some agencies, because if your council or commission's not meeting and you don't get in to be able to advertise it, now you're changing all your specs, and that can be a lot to go through, because you got to make sure that anything that was modified gets updated with your advertisement. Once you advertise though, you're using what you advertised with all the way through construction. You're not making changes. This slide is relating to what you're putting together during design. Once you advertise, that's it through your whole contract. So there's 2 specification groups that write specs. Yeah.
So just as you start with one spec book and follow it through, do the same with, when you start a project, take your lag manual that's current for that time when you're advertising and save a copy of that, and take a copy of the spec book and the standard plans and all those things, because that's what you're married to for the rest of the contract. And so I like to keep those files together so that when I need a reference, it's right there in one folder. Just a tip, something we do.
Thanks, Ruth. And so there are 2 APWA committees that write local agency specs. There's a Division 1 committee. I'm on that committee. I've been on there for about a decade, and Ruth has been since the inception of, on here, the link says Division 5.
Which is what it started as.
And that it did. It started as Division 5. This is where the asphalt specification that every local agency should be using is there. But they also write now for 2 through 9. So
all construction materials.
All construction materials. Yeah.
Diane, this is Sarah. Could you, how difficult is it to get approval from local programs to use the current year spec book in that last quarter? Like what kind of lead time or preparation do local agencies need? Should they start, if they go to local programs in November to get approval, is that too late? What kind of lead time does that take?
This should not take long. This should be a very simple request from your local programs person that you work with all the time. So if you're Olympic region, we're talking about Mark Brooks, Bob Berg, Brian Moorhead. In the Northwest region, that might be SEMA. I'm not sure what all regions we have represented here, but it's your person that you're normally working with. And it shouldn't take long, you know, depending on if somebody's on vacation or holidays. Maybe you're looking at a week. This should be a very simple yes. This should be something they're always approving, that they just need something in their file to show what book you're advertising with.
Okay, so it's not complicated, like get, you know, project obligation and you need like a 3-month lead time. You can, at this point, the project is rolling.
Not yet. Yeah, not yet. So an obligation packet, you have a lot of people looking at that. It routes from local programs to headquarters and all around. This should be a simple, you should be able to email them, get an email back and a yes. This should not be something that's ever denied. This is more of a notification to them that which book you're advertising with. Even though you do need their approval, it should always just be a yes. This should be a very quick one. And Mark retired. Oh,
Yes, Mark did retire.
man. So I don't, do you know if his position was filled?
It is open. His position is open, I believe, and being advertised right now.
Okay, so we think it's being advertised now. So Don Fletcher then is
Currently the one.
yep. So Don Fletcher for your region. Man, we can't have big parties now, so I'm
Yeah,
sad we're missing these things. That's well, good for Mark. So in the specifications, it's just kind of a really general guideline. Division 1 is your general requirements. This is your legal stuff. With FHWA funding, you may not modify Division 1 without local programs approval. And this takes time. Yes, so you send your Division 1 changes to local programs, but your local programs person is not who is generally saying yes to this or never saying yes. It's going to headquarters, it's going through federal highways. And so this is why using the APWA Division 1 is super helpful, because we have specifications in there that are approved for any local agency to use.
They say so on each one.
Each one tells you, yes, if it's approved for FHWA funding or not. There are things in there there are things on this website here that we gave you that say cannot be used, not for use on FHWA funded projects. Do not use those on your federal aid projects. Those are things like there's been a change to, bounce ahead to liquidated damages. There's a new calculation sheet for that. APWA has kept the old calculation because that's much simpler for a lot of agencies to use. It doesn't always work on big projects or small projects or paving projects because it's not designed, those calculations aren't designed for every project, but it's worked well for a lot of years. So that is there, but you cannot use it on FHWA. You have to use the new spreadsheet. So make sure that they say they're approved for federal aid use, but this does take time if you want to send something in. But there are good reasons to do this. An example of one is when I worked at City of Tacoma, the police officers had some language in their police contract that we needed to cover in the specifications because they were having to hire police officers when signals were shut down, but they had a certain order that they had to go about, that contractors needed to go about hiring that police officer to direct traffic. And that was a union, it was a contract issue. And so we needed to follow their contract. It was approved by federal highways, but I want to say it took me 6 to 8 weeks to get that approved. So you don't want your projects hanging up on that. You want to start that process early when you know that your agency has something different that you need approved. It takes time. Oh, here we go. Jennifer Harrington. Thanks, Tim.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a comment here. You guys hit on right-of-way briefly. Probably worth mentioning that most projects are likely to need a right-of-way phase, even when you don't need to acquire right-of-way, as most will have some work outside of right-of-way and need at least temporary construction easements for driveway blends, utility adjustments, etc. And this came from Michael, and that is absolutely correct. It used to be if you were working with someone on their driveway, that, you know, you could go outside the right of way because it was mutually benefiting and you could get a temporary construction easement, or there was a driveway permit for a while that did not need right of way. Anything now needs right of way. And even when you don't have right of way, your project manager has to have the no right of way certification.
Fill out the form.
And there is a form to fill out. So there's always something to do for right of way, even if you're not obligating. But if you even have a temporary construction easement, even just for a driveway, you might impact someone. Like if you take out a tree that might be right on the right of way line and those roots are going onto private property, you need some property restoration, you have a right of way phase. So that is absolutely true. And something to be really cognizant of there as well is that you cannot obligate right of way without a NEPA. So you have to work that into your project timelines. Federally funded projects, they take longer and they cost more money. And I know that a lot of people on this call, Thera and I, we've had this conversation so many times, that your region gets these small amount of monies that you're being told, don't spend less than $500,000 on a federally funded job, but your agency might get 250,000 or 300,000 or 400,000. Well, you can't do both because, oh, you have to obligate by August 1st. So you can't combine 2 years worth of money into then a bigger project that makes sense to use federal highways. So it's really a catch-22, you know, with the money that you get. So unless you're applying for additional funds and merging those funds, it's just a tough spot to be in. And it just is, you know, how it is. So, so Division 1, think about your legal things that maybe your prosecuting attorney in your agency, or maybe like for us, it was our police contract, things that need to be different for your agency. Think about those early, write those specifications early and get those in for approval so that that's not what you're waiting on when you advertise. So divisions, well, yeah, if you don't have to do it, don't. Just stick with what's there if you can. Divisions 2 through 8 are your unit bid item specifications. You can change these. You should always give 3 alternatives or an approved equal, provide a public interest finding. If you're modifying these, you cannot sole source with federal highway funds without putting a PIF in your file. So the CFR has changed. These do not, when you sole source something, this doesn't have to be approved by WSDOT anymore, but it needs to be in the project file. And it still has to follow all the federal highway regulations. So an example of this would be, you don't want to have 500 types of lights in your agency because if you're a designer, it might not make any difference to you that you're running AGI 32, you're getting the right amount of foot candles, like all the cars are going to see, all the pedestrians can be seen, the bicycles, it's great. But oh, now your maintenance guy really doesn't like you because like every single project you pick a different light bulb and now they need to buy a whole new workshop to just store light bulbs. So there are certain things that you want, your traffic signal cabinets, you want everything in your agency, you know, or as much as you can to be the same, to make it easy for your maintenance staff as they need to maintain things. So you can fill out a PIF for that, put it with your project, and you can get the same traffic signal cabinet as every other intersection that your agency has for maintenance purposes, but it has to meet your Buy America or Buy American, depending if you got FHWA or FTA funds. So you need to be buying American-made products, even though you no longer have to have this PIF signed off ahead of utilization.
Doesn't take away that Buy America.
Yeah, Buy America is still there.
You can't use this to bring in, import light poles.
Yes, yep. You can spec a light pole from Minnesota or whatever, so that they're all matching, they're all the same color, so they can be painted easily, that kind of thing, but you can't bring them in from Canada, Mexico, anywhere else. So you can now do agency supplied materials, is my understanding, sole source. The 3-week advertisement, though, we believe you still need to have signed off by federal highways. So that piece of the PIF.
One of the drop-down options on that PIF.
It's a drop-down option on the PIF, but you still need approval for that. And then Division 9 is all your materials. But if you make a change to Division 2 through 8 for materials, then WSDOT has asked that you put those materials in the specification it's going with instead of revising Division 9. So there's nothing that requires this. It makes it easier for WSDOT, and if it makes it easier for you to get along with your local programs person, it doesn't really hurt to do that. If you're writing a spec, it doesn't hurt to put it where they want it. And it might help contractors, if this is something that, like maybe the AGC, there's an AGC WSDOT team that meets, and this may be something that the contractors have asked for, so that when they're looking at specs, it may be easier for them to bid.
They're all in one place.
They're always consistent. Because when you think about it, this is something just to keep in mind. We work on projects a year, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, if you have right away, 4, if you have a lot of permits. So we have these projects for a long time. We get really familiar with them, and you're putting something out, you're asking somebody to bid sometimes on things that are multi-millions of dollars, and they get 2-3 weeks to look at it. So there is a lot to be said for trying to be consistent and to not changing certain things. Like, yeah, you have some council member that wants some bid item, but if you can get them to see the light that consistency is going to save everybody money and time and arguments, the more we can use the standard specs, the APWA specs, and not be adding. There's a time and a place for special provisions. They are needed on projects, but the more we can use standards, the better for everybody. So these are some of the more recent-ish specification changes. We talked a little bit about liquidated damages. It is no longer just the calculation with working days. This is from 2015, so it's not that new, is the recycled materials legislation. And so this is an interesting one because a lot of the agencies here might think, oh, this doesn't apply to me, because it's for 100,000 residents or more. For local agencies, you must request and accept bids that include the use of construction aggregate and recycled concrete materials for transportation infrastructure projects. So maybe not a parks project, but if you've got bikes, vehicles, pedestrians, that's transportation. And if you're less than 100,000, you don't have to require the recycled concrete materials information with your bid, but you must establish a plan and implement the strategies to achieve the recycled materials law. So to do that, you have to have a written plan in your file, or you have to adopt the plan that the state has. This does not relate to federal highway funding. This is a Washington state law, but the RCWs are there. It started out as 70, 95, 805, and 807 has been recodified. And I just suggest, if you're not familiar with this, or if you don't think your agency is following this, you might want to just check out this RCW. Just make up a plan, put it through your council or commission. Maybe your plan says that you're not going to do anything. Maybe that's your plan. But have, yeah, that it's not worth it, because the recycled concrete, a lot of this was put in place when they demolished like the floating bridge, and when they were putting in the Kingdom, the tunnel, when they took down the viaduct. So there was all this extra concrete, and they wanted it to get used and recycled. So you can put something like that. We don't have enough recycled concrete in our area to make it worthwhile to recycle, because if
We
you
have to import it, which would
yeah,
drive up the cost.
yeah, and maybe that's not good for the environment. Maybe you're bringing in recycled material from Spokane and you're in Seattle, or maybe you're in Spokane, it's all coming from Seattle.
Legitimate.
It's not good for the environment
Right.
either. So, but make sure you have something on file to show why you're not doing it. And then fabrication inspection costs. This is something that I think this is not a newer spec. But I think a lot of people were just ignoring this for quite a while, because we were all getting our items from like concrete. You're getting girders from TranTech in Tacoma. So you're not really worried about how far an inspector is going because it was close by. But the more and more, and particularly, I think we're going to be seeing this just go crazy with the injunction, because WashDOT will be doing so many more fish bearing projects. There will be a lot more prefabricated concrete. There will be a lot more rebar use, steel. We're getting orders coming from Minnesota. I've heard of catch basins coming out of Arizona. So when you're getting those items inspected for your federal highway projects, that costs money. And so if it saves the contractor $50 per catch basin to get it from Arizona, so they're giving you a $50 less bid, but it's costing you $2,000 to send somebody down there to inspect it. This spec allows you to bill the contractor to recover those costs of inspection. Something we didn't always worry about, but now we want to make sure that we're using the right spec to cover those costs if you're worried about it. And then change orders and minor changes. There's a new APWA spec. This is brand new. A lot of agencies couldn't use this because maybe their construction manager or their project managers were not able to sign for the $35,000 minor change, which is what was in the spec book. So this allows agencies to set a dollar amount less than $25,000. So if you're, as a construction manager, PM, city engineer, whatever, if you can sign for $10,000, you can now put that fill-in amount, and now all of a sudden you can use minor changes. So that can really help. It helps in multiple ways. It helps if you're an agency that has to bring all your change orders to your council or commission. I hope that's none of you, but that there are agencies out there that have every change has to come in. It also can give you some contingency if your legislative authority does not allow you to go over the bid price without coming back for authority to spend additional. Is you can put in, say, we're going to have $10,000 per change order and we think we might have 4 or 5, you can put $50,000 in there as an estimated cost, and now you have a little bit of latitude before you go back to your commission. If it takes you 2 weeks to get to your council or commission, you can't pay standby for contractors out in the field while you wait to get budget authority to spend that money. So that is hopefully a really good change for local agencies to be able to use that for dollar amounts that make sense for you. There is fairly new, I think it was added in 2018, although it might have been an amendment at that time and then added in 2020, but somewhere around that time frame, disputes review board. So this is a 3-party agreement that you can put this bid item into. I would suggest it only on probably your larger projects. If you have projects that are, maybe your agency usually does some $500,000 to $2 million jobs, and all of a sudden you have a $10 million job, you might want to throw that in. And I would say probably anything 15 million or more for sure, I would put something like this in. This gives you a built-in way of your project to take care of disputes. And there is a panel of people that they apply through WashDOT to be on the disputes review board, and they are approved as their kind of mediator types of people that have some experience either with construction or as attorneys, and they will figure out what's fair between an agency and a contractor. So it saves litigation costs by working with people that understand construction. And then there is HMA and pervious local agency specifications. Ruth's on the committee that writes that, and I'm gonna mute.
So the HMA and pervious specifications that are in there were designed mainly to help local agencies that have to meet the low impact development requirements that State Department of Ecology, I believe it is, had passed. So essentially it helps fill that need. Now DOT can't possibly use, at least not at this point in time, pervious pavements on the freeway. They did try it, by the way. They lasted about 3 days and had to go grind them out, and that's not a joke, it's a fact. They were trying it because they were trying to be team players. Unfortunately for them, it didn't work out, and fortunately though, with this group, we put together a really good set of specifications for not just pervious HMA, but also for concrete and for pervious bases. We also wrote a specification, well, didn't write, but approved for use on all federal aid projects is the ATB specification, which local agencies like to use a lot. It's kind of an easy mix for them to manage and work with, and DOT had no use for it anymore, but a lot of local agencies do. So that was another one that we added to our mix of revised specifications for local agency use. As they come along, we try to change them, you know, to be more friendly for the situation that cities and counties find as they go along. And that's true of all our material changes. You know, DOT just doesn't really build a lot of water lines. I mean, they don't. The cities and counties have to do it all the time. So largely those contributions to the spec book came from people like us, consultants and agency owners that have to do it. And so now we're doing it through APWA to amend the specifications. That's good.
Well, thanks, Ruth, for that. And now we're about halfway through. So this is a great time to take a break. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in and we'll address those before we move on towards advertisement, award, and construction stuff. So we'll be back. Let's take 15 and we'll start up again at 2:30.
Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started again. Hopefully everybody had a chance to clear your heads a little bit and get ready for, you know, wring out the sponge and get ready to soak up all the next round of this. It's just astonishing to me, the requirements, and now I can really appreciate why people say, be careful what you federalize. So we will turn it back over to you, Diane and Ruth, and look forward. And again, people, please feel free to pop in questions into the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll field them on the fly or catch them at the end of a section. Thanks, you guys. Take it away.
There we go. Okay, thanks, Sarah. So we will next talk about advertisement and award. And most of what we're going to cover here, go back to the cover slide. This is really good practice in this section for all of your projects, not just your FHWA funded projects. And so we're gonna go ahead on to the advertisement piece. So first, I see Ted on the attendee list. Thanks for letting us use this example affidavit. When you advertise your project, once you have your obligation for construction, you actually have to advertise within 6 weeks. And if you don't, well, then you better be working closely with your local programs people. But a lot of that is because you're going to have DVE goals, training goals, wage rates, that can change. And so you need to really be, once you obligate, you're providing a copy of your about 90% plans at that time for review and your estimate to get your DBE goals and those things to local programs. So you have to move quickly. And you're going to advertise, you're going to include your Title VI language in the advertisement. You need to keep a copy of your affidavit. So this here's an example of what that looks like. And you need that in your file for review. It's not enough to just have one, you need a copy. You need a 3-week bid period, 2 weeks for a PIF. So the lag manual still talks about needing a PIF for everything. The PIF, as we talked about before, does have the 2-week pull down, but that is one of the items that you do still need approval for federal highways, because the actual advertisement period is different for counties, cities, first-class cities. They're all set by RCW, but for federal aid, you need 3 weeks. And so you do need approval to shorten that. As we talked about, you have to have 6 weeks. You have to advertise within 6 weeks of your construction obligation. And then there are spec fill-ins that you'll need to follow when you advertise. So this, it would already be done in the specifications section, but I just wanted to touch on it here because there are things that deal with the advertisement in Division 1. And there's things like all questions from a contractor must be in by like the prior Friday to opening, or it might actually be Thursday. So if you open bids on a Friday or a Monday, that may not give you enough time to put out an addendum or to give a list of questions and answers to all contractors. And you do not want to talk to any contractors during advertisement. You want all questions to come in writing, and you don't respond to any contractors to that contractor. You put out the answers to all contractors where your entire bidders list can see the answers at the same time. You have to keep a good playing field. So, and it is Thursday, it's 1024. It asks for all explanation or interpretation questions by writing the Thursday prior to the bid opening. So depending what day your agency opens bids, you might want to change that. And then you have your minor changes that we talked about as well. You'll want to take care of those fill-in items. When you advertise, you get your bids in, you need to assure that you're not just awarding to the low bidder. There's a lot of criteria for who the responsible low bidder is. You want a responsible, responsive bidder. And so your responsible bidder criteria is covered by RCW 39.4.350, and it's also covered under APWA GSP 102.14. And this is important. This goes back to the legal requirements such as WSDOT has to pre-qualify. A local agency is not allowed to pre-qualify. And so your bidder needs to be a registered contractor. They need a current unified business identifier number, UBI number. They need industrial insurance, workers' comp coverage. And what that's for is the contractor normally cannot be sued for damages for a work-related injury or illness. They go through L&I for some of that, so that's what that's about. They need an Employment Security Department account, state excise tax registration, and they cannot be disqualified from bidding under these RCWs. So there's links there to check those out. They cannot have any apprenticeship violations if that's applicable for your project. And this is where when you turn your 90% to local programs, you're getting training goals, you're getting DBE goals, and your bidder needs to meet the criteria for those goals. And then you need your contractor to certify through a sworn statement or an unsworn declaration under penalty of perjury that they are not a willful violator of labor laws within the past 3 years. And so this is something that they are signing with a declaration of perjury or having certified. Then there's an L&I approved training, or having completed 3 or more public works projects and maintained a valid business license in Washington for at least 3 years. So when you look up a contractor on L&I's website, it should tell you if a business is exempt from having this, if they've taken the training, and you should be able to see that this is approved from L&I. It does not have to be the L&I training. L&I does offer this training, but there's also training that is approved by L&I. So either one of those. And then a lot of agencies have a checklist for this. You want to keep that checklist in your file. If you don't have one and you have federal aid, but you haven't used federal aid for a while, check out MRSC's website. They have a model statement that satisfies like all the labor law requirements, and they have from a lot of, it's actually most of them are ports that I saw on MRSC's website, but there's a lot of checklists up there that you could take and modify. You can also ask maybe one of your neighboring cities or counties. For PRTPO, I know for certain that Kitsap County has one, and Mason County has one. So if you're familiar with those agencies, they might share with you as well if you don't have that.
Diane, could I ask a question about the qualified bidder requirements, responsible bidder requirements? And this may be, I remember back in 2009 with the ARA funding that came down, and it was federal funding, and there were a lot of contractors working with federal funding for the very first time. And they had I'm sure a lot of contractors lost their shirts. They were unable to, they had a lot of experience working projects and doing, and they went through this, you know, these bidder procedures, and they, you know, they had difficulty. They had difficulty complying with all the federal requirements, especially in the small cities that didn't have a lot of experience managing federal projects. Has that changed at all? Or is it possible that you could have a responsible bidder, you know, come in with a low bid who's really never handled a public sector federally funded project? And is that something of concern for local agencies? Or are there enough safeguards in this now that that's unlikely to happen?
That is always a concern. So this L&I approved training, that is a safeguard that was not there before. That was effective July 1st of 2019. So that helps, but L&I, that's only one of the issues that was had, you know, when there was the big housing crash. And so you had contractors, they could build a great road. They were building roads for housing developments, and they could compact pavement, and they knew how to put in a curb and gutter, and, you know, they were making a great product, but they didn't know how to do the paperwork, and it was causing a lot of problems. And maybe they weren't used to, they also might've been used to working on roads that were closed because it was new housing that maybe they were working on. So maybe there wasn't traffic until they had their projects complete. So maybe traffic control, that was an issue that we were running into in that era. So this helps because one of the big things that was not understood by developers was prevailing wages. And when you have federal funds, you're not just meeting state prevailing wage, you're meeting federal prevailing wage. And in Washington state, a lot of times our state prevailing wage is higher than the federal prevailing wage. But if a federal wage was higher, or if a contractor just hadn't even thought of that because they had different requirements for a private development, then that's where a lot of them did lose their shirts, or a lot of them ended up out of business because their bids did not take into account what they actually needed to pay. And now we have all the, you know, we're doing wage rate surveys, you're doing wage rates with DBEs, you're doing surveys with DBEs, And in some cases on projects, you might be interviewing the same DBE more than once because maybe they have a sub role and then maybe they're a lower tier sub and you're interviewing them for both. So there are more safeguards, but that is still a concern. And this is where you're leaning maybe on your local programs staff, maybe you're leaning on consultants if you're not fully aware of all of these requirements, because you have to dot all your I's and cross all your T's with your federal money. And you should be concerned and asking questions when you get a contractor that has not been doing public works projects and working with federal aid. Then you have to be even more on top of your game than you already have to be. And it's hard. There's a lot of game to be on top of with federal aid.
Okay, well, thanks. I think got the work cut out.
So Ken was asking about where to find Mason County's checklist, and I think that Lucy Castillo could help you. I'll actually email both of you. Ken, my email's at the end of this. If you send me an email, I'll email you and Lucy and ask her to send you their checklist. So when you verify your responsible bidder, and this actually, Thera, when you're talking about this, a good point for this is also that there are specifications when you do not have federal aid. If you want to use the specification with federal aid, you have to send it into WSDOT to get it approved. But where you can specify additional criteria, the responsible bidder criteria we're talking about meets our state law and our federal and the federal requirements of what a contractor has to have. You can add your own agency requirements as well. And that can be that, you know, if you have, say, a project at an airport, and so you're working with concrete, you may not want a paving contractor that works with HMA. You might want to say, we need a contractor that has done at least 3 airport projects over the last 10 years. And that could be small airports, you know, if you're at SeaTac or something, but you want a contractor that has done airports before. You can do criteria like that as well. So that's something to be aware of. But if it's federally funded, you have to send that criteria first to FHWA. And they are not going to approve things like you needed to work on a project that had, you know, was between $1 and $2 million, had 300 lineal feet of curb and gutter and 15,000 tons of HMA or something. That's too specific. They want it to be very general when you add that in, but you can get approval for that, which can help. I would only recommend that for specific types of projects, like when they bored the tunnel in Seattle. You don't want, you know, a contractor that has only built buildings to come in and bore that tunnel. You want a contractor that has bored a tunnel before. So it's acceptable to say, you know, hey, this is a big deal. We're boring under businesses. We're boring under existing roads, under existing infrastructure, that you want someone that has bored a tunnel before. So there are times and places to add additional bidder criteria. We're just talking about the minimum bidder criteria today. So these are things you want printed copies of in your file, or screenshots that show the actual date you want. Like down at the bottom part here of your screen, there's usually a date and time. You want that in your screenshot, that you've checked these things. You do not want to be in your PMR and saying, oh, I'll go check the debarred list right now. And maybe your contract was a wintered over project that shut down in the winter because it needed 2 paving cycles. Maybe it needed 2 fish windows to complete. And you're checking to see if a contractor's debarred in 2021, but you awarded the contract in 2019. You better have something that shows that they were not debarred in 2019 when you awarded the project. So all of these you want in your file, but you also want the dates to show that your contractor, tradesperson, or business verification. There's the link here, verify And this one link is going to give you their UBI number, industrial insurance, workers' comp status, and contractor training status. So you're getting 3 birds with 1 stone there. Your debarred contractors list, there is federal debarment and state debarment. You want to make sure you're going to sam.gov and checking for federal debarment as well on your federal aid jobs. Department of Revenue tax registration is also verifiable from a website. Now, employment security, you can request a letter from them. You can also have a checklist that the contractor fills out when they bid, where they verify that they have employment security. The reason why they need this is to close the project out. So if you award to them without verifying this, you can do that, that's fine, but you're not gonna be able to close your project if they don't have this. So hopefully your contractor is telling you they have it because they do, because they need it to close the project. You also need them to have it, but the only way to verify this, if you wanna verify it before, is to request it by letter. Otherwise, you're just trusting your contractor. I'm gonna turn it over to Ruth. She's gonna run through construction documentation with you.
So running through construction documentation is about all you can do in the time allotted us. So the first question you have to ask is electronic or paper, because at this point in time, we've been forced into electronic well ahead of the plan, I believe. You still need permission to not have printed files for federal highway projects. I do believe you're going to see a change in that very soon, but it doesn't take very much to shoot a request to the local programs office to ask them if you could please have permission to do the electronic documentation and work with them to set something like that up. You want to, thank you. So documentation begins with communication, believe it or not. You do have a team here. It takes a lot of people to put together construction documentation. First thing you want to do is establish rules of engagement, I like to call it. You're going to make a list of who you're going to talk to. That's highly important for everything, whether it's emergencies or just who has the authority to approve this, that, and the other. First contact to establish emergency call list is the very first item of business for anything, and keep it up to date. People change during construction. They might be one project manager starts and someone else finishes. So you want to make sure that those emergency contacts are kept current throughout the project. Email subject lines is another thing that I like to kind of start in the beginning with. If you're going to send me an email with an attachment that I need to process, if you'll put a consistent subject line in there, like city of blank, this bridge, I'll know what project it goes to and I'll address it immediately. Without those kinds of things in place, oftentimes things end up in the spam folder unexpectedly because you're getting all kinds of submittals with attachments, and oftentimes email protocol doesn't like that stuff. So I find it's easier anyway, just my suggestion there. Talk about submittal format, transmittals, and establish an expectation of when you're going to expect to have your consultants or whomever respond to any submittal. So the next thing I recommend is you get it organized. You can set your whole construction file up to follow the PMR checklist pretty much. And the reason I recommend you do that is because they are the ones that are going to look most closely at your files. And if you follow the checklist to set up particularly material files by bid item, it makes it much easier for the reviewers to find what they're looking for. They're going to select an item of work to review. And if you have all the item work in one folder, they're only going to one place. Your agency CA agreement, we've keep talking about this CA agreement, certification acceptance agreement. It is an agreement signed between your agency and the DOT local programs office that says you agree that you will keep staff on board to be able to administer federal funded projects, and that staff includes a licensed engineer, and then there are some other requirements in there. If you do not have a CA agreement, you have to either have another agency or the Department of Transportation act as your certification acceptance authority, which means they're going to sign all your change orders, they're going to do your contract admin work. If you look at the CA agreement, those of you who are in CA agencies, it will tell you who signs what, usually not by name, by position. So, you know, the mayor has the authority to sign this, and the city engineer has authority to sign all of this. So those are broken out specifically in the CA agreement, and make sure you follow those. And also, I recommend, if you haven't looked at it in a while, go back and review it when you start a new project and make sure everything still applies. Sometimes job descriptions change, sometimes jobs themselves change. Those are things that language that needs to be current to make it applicable. If you're using federal highway funds, I can't stress enough building it around a PMR checklist for number one, because those are the things that they find are important. And just throw everything into that one file and keep it sorted out. Material files are best if they're set up by bid item. You can find everything from a single day paving in 5 minutes or less. That's always the question. If you have them set up by bid item, it's pretty easy to do. So I know that sounds like maybe a no-brainer, but believe it or not, one day of paving can actually end up with 100 pages of documentation and testing and tickets and all kinds of business. So yeah, that's a kind of thing. If you set up your files right, we get it together. The tracking part, I recommend you use the record material for tracking. Probably the one thing you see most submittals on are materials. Approval and acceptance actions can all be tracked on the record of material. You can have certain modifications to it if you follow the local agency guideline, lag manual. Appendix 52.107 has a list of local agency exceptions and allowed modifications. I recommend you follow those as well. They'll not only save you some money, but some things just don't make sense for local agencies, where for DOT they did. For instance, sampling and testing of, say, geotextile fabric. Well, when they're putting down miles and miles of it on the road, they have lots of samples to be able to cut. I mean, lots of rolls to cut samples from. If you're using a little dab of it behind a wall, you're going to cut a bigger sample than you're going to use. So it's not cost effective to do that, if you get my drift. Other than the fact that if it is crucial for safety, I highly advise testing it, just as an example. RFI logs, change order logs, submittal logs, all those things are easy to do. Excel spreadsheets work really well for that, or you can buy some really expensive computer programs. I actually haven't found anything yet that works as well as the Excel spreadsheet, and I've tried a lot of them. Certified payroll. You need to track every sub and the prime for each week that they work, starting with the first day that they're on the job and until their work is finished. You need to track your DVEs, the work they're doing, and your attainment levels throughout the project. And then there's a contractor information log. Again, this comes directly from local programs office. They would really like you to use the checklist that's in the information log in the lag manual and make sure you keep that together, and they will follow the checklist. It's right there. It is, I believe, in chapter 52. It's one of the appendices. I was going to put it in here, and obviously I managed to skip that. So. Oh, Diane says this later in the presentation. Okay.
Under PE, we have both.
Oh, okay.
It's earlier.
Okay. Oh, that's right. We did have it in there. Oh, there it is right there. Prime and subcontractor information. This is the log I was talking about. This is, again, the local programs office likes this. I like this myself. It made it easy when I was doing it. This is an actual DOT form, again, available through their website. You don't have to use this scrunched up little copy from the lag manual. You can download a fresh one and use it, and you can fill it in. I mean, it's a fillable PDF. Okay. Traffic control, big deal. It is a big deal, is safety. And safety is like the number one thing that we in construction, we are all just panicked about for good reason. A lot of damage can be done. Nobody wants to have that happen on their job. Traffic control is where it begins. So every set of plans you have approved for federal highway funding, if it is in an area where there is live traffic, you will have to have a set of approved traffic control plans incorporated into the contract. At the pre-con, the contractor will tell you whether he is going to accept the traffic control plans in the contract or offer you their own. Hope that they accept the ones you have, especially if you're in the Northwest region, somewhere close to where you're going to intersect with DOT, because going through the DOT approval process for traffic control plans can be challenging. So hopefully they'll all just follow what you put in the plans, and they have to follow DOT too, but you'll have already gone through that approval process by the time you're out to add, so you don't have to go through it again. Any changes to a traffic control plan should be approved by WSDOT in some cases. I'm going to say when it intersects with a roadway, a highway, or something that would impact a DOT facility, such as an on or off ramp, you're definitely going to, or their right of way, you're definitely going to be involved with DOT in any changes in your traffic control plan. Change orders. So you'd think you're writing a newspaper article, who, what, when, where, why, how, except that's a change order pretty much. You're going to have a description of what the change is, what the reason is, where it's located, if there's any quantity involved, any plan sheets involved in it. If you have to have a justification for the change. And then you also have to address time impacts. Every change order, you have to address time impacts, whether they change the length of time, if you're adding or taking away days or not. And it's just so that they know you didn't forget. And I like this little cartoon here because it pretty well sums it all up. It all depends on your point of view and whether it's a change to the contract or not. So be prepared because it can be a challenge.
I'm going to throw in here that it cannot change the scope of the project. So you can't say like, oh, we're running low and we were going to do 5 blocks. We're going to add another block. When you have federal money, you cannot change your scope. Change orders are for change within your original project.
That's correct. You cannot change your scope or your footprint. Your project footprint cannot change because then your NEPA is no longer available. So you can't extend that extra block, especially if it's outside your NEPA footprint. Be careful of things like that. So payments to contractors, and you know, when we used to give this training around the state for different places, we say nobody has an open checkbook. Everybody has to have permission to do stuff, and there are limits. You want to have a project ledger going, which we call a monthly estimate in our lingo. We use that estimate process to make payments due to the prime throughout the life of the contract. There must be a source document for every ledger entry marked paid or eligible for payment, and a source document meaning that you are making a field note record saying what the materials are, where they're located, whether they were approved, anything that had to do with that particular item of work needs to be documented and available for backup if asked for. The inspectors on your project are going to be the one who primarily are going to generate field note records and force account fees, which are the 2 main documents that we use to generate payments. They are the ones that are with boots on the ground. They're the ones that see it going on. You have to have a good relationship with your inspectors because they are the ones that are going to be able to collect all your certifications, your quantity, your delivery tickets, I had one ask me today, do I have to collect all the paper they're bringing me? I said, yeah, sorry, but that's what you do. When you go through these things as an agency before you're paying, you're going to leave fingerprints, I like to say. You want to make it known that somebody checked it, somebody added it up, did the calculations, made sure that they were in the right place, and you're going to do that by I do it electronically with a fill and sign feature on Adobe. You can just check boxes and put your initials and a date, and that's at least saying that you took care of it. So you're gonna, everything you look and check, put a little squiggle with your initial and date it, or if you're doing it electronically, use the fill and sign feature, which is available on basic Adobe anyway. It's free, so you can do that, and that helps keep your documentation straight. Prompt pay. So you don't want to violate the prompt pay law because it is a law, and it's a 30-day window after installation or completion of the work, and it allows you to withhold payment if it's unsatisfactory, as long as certain conditions are met, and you have to give written notification 8 days, within 8 days of installation, and you also have to make payment within 30 days of satisfactory completion of the work that was previously considered ineligible for payment for whatever reason. So that has to be made within 30 days. And this all filters into the DBE thing. So we were talking about recording your payments in the DCMS system. Well, the contractors have to record their payments as well. So you're paying a prime contractor and you're recording that you paid him. He in turn has to record that he paid his subs. And this is how they follow the DBE payment. And it's also how they are following the prompt pay to make sure that everyone is complying with the prompt pay laws for the state of Washington. Okay. Project closeout. 10 years later, you're ready to close it. And you still have 6 months worth of work to do, just collect all the paper to do that. So I'm laughing, but it's really, it is true. There's a lot to it. First of all, you're going to grant substantial completion, and that gives you full and unrestricted use of the facility. We say roadway here on this slide, and the spec book says that, but not all projects are now roadways. Some of them are trails, and some of them are different parking lots and different things like that. So as long as you have full and unrestricted use of that facility, you can issue substantial completion. At that point, you stop counting working days. If you're over working days, you begin to calculate your liquidated damages, and then prepare yourself for the fireworks after that one. Punch list items can still be open on this. The key is, can you use the roadway, the work that has to be completed, as long as they don't have to set up traffic control or close the facility in order to do it, you can grant substantial completion. The 2 bullets there, landscaping can remain if there's an APWA special utilize and full unrestricted use specification in there. And the other thing you're going to do at substantial completion is call your WSDOT local programs office and ask them to come out and do an inspection. And that inspection, actually, they'll help you with the punch list too if they see things that you don't see. And they're going to review your project while they're out there for ADA compliance if you had any ramps that were going in. You can grant physical completion when the contractors left the site. There will still be documentation and paperwork out. You should have your Class A signs taken down at this point in time. Physical completion is when you no longer have any work left on the roadway itself, so that's where your Class A should be going. Final acceptance is when all your documentation has been completed and submitted and approved and turned in, and then you can issue your notice of completion and send that to DOT, who in return will send you a letter telling you about the closeout process from their point of view. That letter from local programs will outline the documentation, retention, and archiving requirements. I highly recommend you archive as soon as possible. And then I also highly recommend that when that archiving time is, retention time is over, that you destroy immediately. There is such a thing as having too much information. And I have seen agencies have to go back and pay restitution for something that wasn't even required at the time of construction because they didn't have it documented they did it. If you're done with the project and the retention period's over, dump it. Just my own thought on that, but you can have too much information in your files. I think so. I think that's you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, switch sound here for a second. Okay. So another part of your project closeout, and something, I'm just going to say this, after 20 years, I've finally got down substantial completion final, and maybe I don't, I have to look back, substantial physical final. But when I first started doing this, I was like, how many types of completion do we really need here, right? Like it was confusing. So in the spec book, 101.3 has all of those, has all the definitions. And then APWA has some of those definitions that are slightly modified for local agencies. That was the bullet with the landscaping, because you have that window where you can't plant certain plants until after October, but if your project's done in July, you know, you might as well give them substantial completion. So that's part of that, but all those definitions, you always can just go back and look in the spec book, 101.3. So when you're closing out your project, you do not hold retainage any longer on federally funded projects. So this is this RCW 6028011. So that is why we did not have retainage listed in your project closeout requirements. If you have other funding sources that allow retainage, that is required by Washington state law. So you're going to have retainage when you're using your local funds, state funds, TIB, if you're a county, when you're using RAP funds. But when you have federal highway funds, retainage is not allowed. So you will have your notice of completion. This is the link to this project to this file on the WashDOT website. You file it with Employment Security Department, Labor and Industry, and Department of Revenue. So this is where if a contractor says they have an Employment Security Department contract or account, but they don't, they had to have one to be awarded the project. The reason why is because they need one to close it out. So you're going to send your notice of completion to these 3 agencies. You're going to hear back usually from Employment Security Department the same week, and usually Department of Revenue within a few weeks, and then L&I is usually your last one that you hear from. Not always, but almost always, they're the last ones. So you need all 3 of these back. It is not required to do a notice of completion for any project over $35,000. When we're talking about federal money, you should never have a project with less than $35,000 in federal funding. You will spend more than $35,000 to implement any federally funded project. So you never want to have less than $35,000. So this closeout process, this should apply to every single one of your federal aid projects. My personal thought is that you don't want to have less than, I'm going to say 300,000, but probably more like 500,000 to $1 million is where you want to have federal money. And I know that a lot of the agencies here get less than that. That is assigned to your agency that you're supposed to split out amongst all of your cities, and you know it's assigned to the county, but it's supposed to be shared with the cities and your transit agencies for projects. And so that gets harder and harder, but maybe try to get multiple grants, you know, and merge that money together to make it larger. And then your final contract voucher, there's a link here for that final contract voucher. You need to have that filled out. Your project closure is completed 60, when you're complete 60 days, your closure begins. You're initiating this by your closure letter or your final inspection. And then you have to submit your final bill within 60 days of your completion date. I think this is yours, right? I'm going to swap back to Ruth here.
I gave you.
Okay, I've forgotten about this one. So when your closure period begins, that's initiated by the closure letter or your final inspection from WSDOT, within 60 days of the completion date, you should submit a final reimbursement request to local programs. Two local programs for payment, and that would be to your region, and they'll forward it to headquarters. The local agency agreement end date, pay attention, this is what Diane was talking about at the beginning. Make sure that you have not gone past it, because if you did, you get to pay for all of this that you're trying to get billed out. So pay attention to that end date and try to make sure that all this project closure paperwork is done prior to that. Final inspection walkthrough with local programs. We already talked about that a little bit. We've done this a couple times, so we're starting to blend the slides together, but they will verify that all your ADA standards are met, that the sidewalk is in fact built, that, you know, if you said you were building a trail with a handrail, that you have a trail with handrails, you know, simple stuff. They're not going to re-engineer your contract for you. They're just going to verify that everything's there and where it should be. And then they're going to look to see that everything's done, that they don't see any unfinished work around. Your class A's are gone, everything's down, and that the project has all the elements that you expect it to based on your description. Local programs then sends that administrative review letter that I was talking about, and that is when they talk about any money reconciliation. You may still have a payment due or may end up paying back overpayments if something changed. I have seen instances where quite inadvertently material on hand was paid on one account at the beginning of, or one estimate at the beginning of the contract, and forgotten to have, you know, back it out again when they went to pay for the bid item, and that's been reconciled now at this administrative review letter stage. So that's when all those kinds of things get put back together again. And then if there are any audit findings, you may have to return some funds. I'll be honest, that's pretty rare. They don't want to take your money back. I mean, contrary to what seems like the case at times. They really want it to be a successful program. So especially once you're at this project closure state, you should be in fairly good shape. And, you know, unless you were out deliberately trying to commit fraud, I don't think you get it by this stage of the game. They would have caught somebody trying to do that anyway, I would think. And then that administrative review letter will give you the retention period I was talking about, and it's normally the 3 years from the final closure date. As again, after that 3 years is up, or your whatever your retention period might be, get rid of it. And unfortunately, if you have any claims on the project, that keeps you from getting your final reconciliation letter from them. So your administrative review letter, or if it comes, it says you have to keep it open. Hopefully this is not a problem though. And then we talk about PMRs and audits. So I keep harping on this. It's the one thing that is accountability for the Fed Aid program to cities and counties. Project management reviews it's a very long checklist of things they look for throughout your contract. We gave you a site earlier in the presentation with all the DOT forms. If you type the word project into control find and then get your search engine up and say project in that list, it will go right to a project management review. It's spelled out project, not PMR. And you can use that checklist. It's an open book test. They look for things like the certificates of material origin. That's very important. The Buy America clause in all your contracts is the one thing that we are just really adhering to and tracking. All the foreign steel has to be declared on your certificate of material origin form. There's a little space to say if you had foreign steel and the value of that steel. That's form number 350-109. Scale certifications need to be in your files. That's for any weighed product that comes into your project. So if you're paying by the ton, you'll need to have scale certifications. If you're paying by the cubic yard, you do not. Traffic control, the advertised plan should be in there. That is another thing they're going to check for. They're going to look for that letter accepting them. If they're again at the bullet, if they're being used without a modification, a letter adopting that is not only a good idea, I believe it's required now. So those are things that they're going to look at. These are things that this list here is things that have turned up on project management reviews in the past, things that were missing. So traffic control, if there was no adoption letter, they'd say that. That would be a finding for them in your project review. They're going to go through that entire checklist. You want to move to the next page here? They're going to check the mobilization calculations. They want to see a formula and a field note record. They want to see DBE on-site reviews, and they will check all of those. Progress payments, every certified payroll justification, let's try that again. Every progress payment has to have a certified payroll justification statement on them that would be signed by the agency. So if you're the city of Tukwila and you're the project manager, you should be the one signing it, but you also have to have this statement that prevailing wages were checked and that you have copies of certified payroll. And the biggest no-no that you can do through local programs, and they see it happen over and over again, is trying to supplement an expired consultant agreement. You cannot do this. Once it's expired, it's gone. There's nothing to extend because you already let it die, so to speak. So pay attention to those. I know some agencies find if you make them all expire on the same day, like March 31st or whatever your fiscal year end is, or a date that works for everybody in your agency, then you have to renew them all at the same time. That's one way to go about it. Diary it, put it on your calendar, something. Don't let them expire. They're easy to supplement before and impossible after. Is that it? Uh-oh, we've got some more stuff. So different kinds of audits that you might come up with. So local programs has a region representative in each of 6 regions around the state, and they will come out during your project and look at your project files and give you some guidance. That's when they have time. They will do that kind of thing. Each CA agency, Certification Acceptance Qualified Agency, will have a project review every 3 years-ish, and you say that ish because not every agency has a federally funded project within 3 years, so sometimes every project gets reviewed. You will be given a list at the end of a PMR that says whatever documentation was missing, what they couldn't find, I should say. And you have a time period in which you can respond either with the located documentation or with some kind of response as to why you don't have it. Sometimes you just muffed it. I mean, it happens. So, there are also routine audits by the state auditor. Any local project with federal funds of over $1 million, actually, I think it's any project over $1 million they can do or have to do an audit on. And they come in and they largely, I'm going to not lie to you, they look at the lag manual and the construction manual, the spec book, and they follow that guidance. So if this lag manual says you have to have this form in your file, the state auditor is going to look for that form. So it's not just the DOT people. Now they might look at it from a different standpoint, and they might go at it from the financial side, drilling down from there rather than from the project documentation side and connecting upward, but they will basically look for the same things that are already outlined. in those documents. Apparently you are also responsible as an agency for doing a single audit performed in accordance with CFR Part 200.501. I would say check with your agency accounting group on that. They probably understand that far better than I do. In fact, I know they do. And so they can guide you through that and help you that part out. And that's the end of what.
Okay, so thanks Ruth for all that great information. I was going to chime in one thing on the state auditor, is that Ruth is absolutely correct. They will look through the lag manual. They're looking for things in the specs. But because there are differences between FHWA, which would control federal law, would control over state law in most cases, there are times where the state auditor will ask you for things that the state would like to see, but that you do not have to have on federally funded projects. And one thing that the state auditor was hitting agencies with a lot, and several agencies were complying, which then made it more difficult for other agencies to say, hey, we don't have to do this, is they wanted to see change orders that reconciled all of the quantities at the end of a project. But our 1044 change order section in the spec book, it spells out that we only need change orders when you have a change, like change of condition or a change in a material, or when you have a bid item that goes over or under the estimated quantity by 25%. So if you had if you had 500 tons in your project estimate that the contractor bid on, and you laid down 496 tons, you don't have to do anything for that change. But the state auditor was asking for, there's other things, this is just an example. They were asking for people to do a change order to reconcile that at the end for all the project or for all of your bid items. You don't have to do those things, but be aware of what your requirements are. You need to bring up the spec book, show that language to the state auditor. You can't just say, oh, we don't have to do that. You need to show the state auditor why you don't need to do it and make that case in your, they will give you a list of, okay, these are your findings. You need to respond and show the state auditor why you don't need to do that. That's actually the case for any project, not just federal highway funded projects, but it's also the case on federally funded projects. So just be aware that once in a while your state auditor will bring up things that, you know, that's something the state wants to see, but in what we do, maybe it isn't required. So, so that's what we have for you today. We are happy to answer questions or have some discussion. I'm not sure there how it's set up, if people can unmute or raise hands and ask questions. I'll let you cover that.
Sure, and thank you both very much. And I just want to say to everybody that what Diane and Ruth are doing, they're working in the same office space, but because of COVID, they're not sharing the same computer monitor. So I really appreciate you all trying to figure out how to tag team and make this work for us with, you know, safely. So thank you. So yes, people can use the Q&A box. We can also do raise hand, and I think I can get people unmuted easily. And I want to open it up and ask a question, kind of a big broad question. I know we have a lot of smaller agencies attending today. I had been under the impression forever that if a non-CA agency obtained federal funding from for a project, that WSDOT pretty much handled the PMR and the documentation and the project management. But as I'm listening to you all, and then what I've picked up again from Brian at local programs, you all, you know, the local agencies, even if non-CA sponsors, are responsible for doing all of this and complying with this. And WSDOT signs off on certain things, but that level of effort rests with the local agency, correct? This is not, they don't have the luxury of obtaining federal funds for a project and then turning that project over to WSDOT to manage. Is that correct?
you don't turn it over because you never actually get it to turn over to begin with. If you're not a CA agency, your region local programs office will either A, find someone to work with you, or you can find your own CA agency to be the lead agency on this project. Or if that's not possible, DOT will act as CA and they will help you hire a consulting firm to do this work.
So then the cost would come out of the local agency's pocket to hire somebody to manage that project.
Well, they're federally eligible expenses, so you can use part of your grant for it. For contract admin, it is a legitimate reimbursable expense, but bear in mind that from the beginning that you need to have a grant large enough to encompass all that. So if you're a non-CA, I would say plan on hiring a consulting firm and build that right into your request when you ask for funding.
Also, another item, something else you can check, but work with your accounting staff before you check the button, is to have some reimbursable for your overhead rate as an agency. There is some laws about if you have less than so much federal aid as an agency, that you can just use a standard, you can get 10% extra back for your overhead, like purchasing computers and things like none of that is covered in your federal, when you're using federal funds. If you need to buy like a vest or something for your inspector, well, they can use that vest on other projects. So you can't bill it to your project, but you can get like an extra 10% for, this isn't even related to your question, but it kind of made me think about it, that there's a box in your obligation paperwork that you can check to get some extra percentage for those kinds of overhead costs that are federal aid requirements, but not directly for a particular project.
And in talking with you all, getting ready for this, there's a lot of work up front that these local agencies have to do as well, just before they even submit their obligation package, which, you know, they really should be thinking about a 3-month lead time for that. But the whole right-of-way question, that needs to be pretty well thought out up front before they've got consultants on board and, you know, have a billable project.
And that the ICE that we talked about, the independent cost estimate, when you're hiring your consultant up front, really you have to do that before you sign the contract, but you really want to do that when you're establishing your TIP. The better the costs can be in your planning phase is important, because the better your costs are at that point, the better your costs are going to cover your project. You don't want to ask for more money than you're going to use, but you don't want to short your agency either. And we've seen lately on some projects where the grant goes in and the agency is denied because they don't feel like the estimate is far enough along to be accurate. They really, when you're being awarded federal funds, they really want those estimates to be accurate. So there's a lot of agency funds that are going to go into preparing a project to receive federal money.
Just to be able to apply.
To be able to apply and to know if you need right-of-way, to know if you know, what are your limits of your project, particularly like if you're going for local bridge program funds, there's only a percentage of that funds that can be used outside of the structure. When you replace that, now if you need your 3 foot of freeboard, or if you're in navigable water and you need a certain elevation to meet Coast Guard requirements or US Army Corps requirements, if you're having to raise the elevation of that bridge, are you into the next intersection up? Are you into an on-ramp for a state highway? Are you into something? Are you going to have to modify all of your ADA at the next intersection, change your signal heights because you have a lot of truck traffic? There's a whole bunch of things you have to look at, more than just maybe it's 16 million or 4 million, depending on the size of your bridge, to replace that bridge. But what are you getting into around it? And then if your bridge funding will only pay a certain percentage outside, what else can you go for? Are you going for regional mobility? Are you going for bike ped? Are you going for STP? Can you even match those types of funds? Are you going for a TIB grant? Are you going for RAP funds to pay for those other pieces? And those should be discussions that you're having with your TIP when you're looking at your TIP.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you don't have your TIP description right and your project termini right, because you don't have, you know, it's sort of a catch-22 in here. At a certain point, you have to know a lot of this before you can even put your, put your STIP project together in order to even begin that whole obligation process. So, and it looks like we've got a couple of questions popping up here too, or suggestions.
Yeah, so we have from Wendy, is there a threshold not to exceed for reimbursing agency project management? And so this actually is kind of dependent on your type of funds. So for example, if you get TIB funds, there are, you can have 15% for administrative on PE, up to 15%, I believe, on construction, but altogether, or maybe it can go 20%, but it can't exceed 30% together, or 25%. There are percentages like that on different, I should know that for this class, but that's for TIB, which is different than for your federal aid. And if Wendy's talking about there's the checkbox, if you are not getting an audited rate as an agency where someone comes in and looks through actually what your administrative costs are and coming up with an actual number, I believe it's 10%. But that's for your administrative, like, overhead rates. For project management, I have never bumped up against a percentage outside of TIB funds that they will not allow, but you do have to be able to justify the cost. You have to have time card systems, like counties have CAMs. There's multiple cities have all kinds of different software.
And they do like to limit it to 15%.
For federal aid.
They look at that.
Okay, so it's definitely looked at. Ruth
Or they
is saying.
Now, whether they're still looking, I don't know, but they were.
I think that they do. I think that they do look, and you have to be able to justify it. And I guess part of it is they'll look at your agency costs and your consultant costs, or if you do it all in-house. Some agencies do like their own survey, and now that is not project management, but if you consult out your design, then you have more agency costs for survey. I'm kind of thinking that, and I'm gonna mute myself and let Ruth. Sorry, we had a technical glitch there, so we're good with that answer. So they do like it to be at 15%. You need to work with your local programs office if you might be over that amount and be able to justify it. Absolutely, yes. Small agencies, they need to be very careful with the grant size and their what you are budgeting with your council when you're going through your budget and your commission, to make sure that you have enough local funds in there to cover your expenses that are not federally eligible. There are things that are not paid for by various different federal grants that need to be covered by the agency in addition to your local match. There are also some federal grants that if you move your money fast enough, that they will either reduce or eliminate your match requirements, but then there are also some things that they may not cover or pay for. So you really have to look at all of that. And then Michael, he says from right away can be expensive too. It'll likely cost 3 to $5K each to properly document TCEs that you may be able to get free or nearly free from willing property owners. And so something else that's really important is that you cannot work with property owners on right-of-way early. If you go out and you get federal money, you better not be talking to property owners about donations or things prior to your right-of-way phase. You cannot negotiate with property owners prior to your NEPA being finalized and your right-of-way being obligated. And you also must inform property owners that they can be paid for their property when you have federal aid. If they're willing to donate, you cannot just take a donation. You have to follow all of the right-of-way requirements, which means making sure that they know that they can be paid for their property. You need to provide that to them in writing and have that in the file. Sometimes it costs more to take a donation than it does to pay someone if it's a small strip or if it's a temporary construction easement to update their driveway, because the paperwork that you need in place to assure that they knew that they could be paid can be costly. And sometimes a temporary construction easement may not have that much cost associated with it, depending on the property values. And then Michael says another pitfall is time to complete phases, right-of-way construction, 10 years per phase. Once you start the next phase, it ends the timeline on the previous phase. It's easy to think of planning to design a larger project in one piece that you'll construct in 3 phases, but then all 3 of those construction phases will have to fit within that one single 10-year window.
That's right.
Starting from the obligation of the first phase, where if you designed each phase on their own, each would have its own 10-year window. And that is absolutely true. And in fact, a project I worked on when I was in Tacoma, WashDOT did not even want to have us phase the project at all. And if you are a non-CA agency, you may not have control over whether or not WashDOT will even obligate something that they do not think that you can get through all those pieces in 10 years. If you are a CA agency, you can make that choice if you think you can make it, but if you don't make it, you're repaying it. But if you're a non-CA agency, that is a WashDOT decision because they are acting as your agency. So
we had that situation. I believe SQUIM has had that situation where they wanted to obligate a project and WashDOT was not confident that they could complete the project, and so they would not obligate the project for them.
And then the problem with that too is that if they won't obligate it, now if they have they have money that has an obligation timeline, if they don't obligate it to something, then they can lose that, and then it ends up going to some bigger entity, which is sad because it's nice if the smaller local communities can get their federal funds back. It's nice to bring those, people are paying into it. It's nice if they get their funds back into their own communities. So yeah, that is a big deal. Going from, Thurston County is like a mid-size agency to Tacoma, that's a fairly large agency that use their federal funds on a lot of large projects. But then going to Mason County, that was a smaller entity, we used our federal funds at Mason County on overlays. We applied for funds, the local bridge program funds, and we applied for like PED or for other individual grants for larger projects, but the money that comes in for the region, it was used for overlays, and for a good reason, because we might have to have some curb ramps and other things, but it was not usually projects that needed right-of-way. Once in a while you did need that with curb ramps, but if you had roads that you were overlaying that did not have sidewalks, you can at least eliminate the right-of-way phase. You can obligate that money quicker. You're staying within an existing footprint. You're not trying to update to the current standards. And some of the current standards, you're gonna have right-of-way. If you need a shared use path, you've got your 14 feet. There's not a lot of areas that have 14 feet. Another thing with right-of-way is you can't just buy extra. You need to really be utilizing everything that you purchase. You can't just buy a 10-foot strip for 2 miles if your project doesn't substantiate that. So there's just a lot of pitfalls and things to be aware of. So,
Diane, I know you said that right-of-way could be its own session, and I think that's, it's pretty apparent why. Could you speak just real briefly to the challenges local agencies face when they already have the right-of-way? Maybe they've obtained it in years past. Can you talk just briefly about the certification process and any pitfalls that agencies might want to be aware of if they're thinking like, oh, right-of-way is going to be a piece of cake because we already, we got this little parcel 10 years ago, when something happened, and what kind of challenges they face with trying to be able to use right-of-way that they already have available that's undeveloped.
So one thing that happens in the right-of-way process sometimes with an agency is they think because they own a parcel that it can be used for a transportation project. But if your parks department owns property, you can't necessarily just have your road or your sidewalk or your frontage improvements there. That can be a right-of-way process. If it is owned because of tax purposes. If a parcel, someone doesn't pay their taxes, it comes back to like your auditor's office. That's not public right of way. If it's owned in fee, there can be issues with that. An example, a project that I had in City of Tacoma, we did an overlay with it was a joint project with City of University Place, and Sound Transit had come through with their when the sounder station was put in, and they upgraded the ADA, and part of the landing was actually on a parcel owned by Burlington Northern, who owned the tracks in that area. And we had no right of way on the project. We could tie into all the driveways. We could replace all the sidewalk. We even widened the sidewalk by 2 feet when we replaced it. We could do all that within the right of way. And this one landing that was not in the right of way that we did not touch because it met ADA requirements, we had to add a right of way phase into our project because we had to purchase that piece of property. It was within our project limits, and we had to purchase that piece of property from Burlington Northern. They didn't even care if we paid for it or anything, but to do the paperwork to trade hands, we had to add a right-of-way obligation phase to our project, and that was not there initially, and that it was a struggle and it costs a lot. So you really have to make sure that there is no right-of-way when you initially do your survey. And the problem is you've usually obligated your PE before you do your survey. So, I mean, it's like, how much work do you put in during your planning phase to check these boxes? And we all know our parcel maps. They are not all 100% accurate when we're looking at aerials, when we're looking at project limits. So there's some big pitfalls that can happen there.
And I think ADA is an interesting angle on that, because I had oftentimes I will say to people that, pavers are just the straight up safe federally funded project. But you and I, Diane, might both remember Olympia, a situation they ended up with after ARA, and they were going to just do a straight paver. And the ADA standards on all of the curb ramps on Union, they were outdated by like 2 years or 3. Very, the standards had just changed. and the utility requirements, and they ended up having to buy right-of-way for like every intersection. And instead of being able to do a lot longer project that they'd envisioned, they had to greatly shorten it. And so it's a tough, until you get into the project, sometimes you just don't know these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then Michael, he says here right away is really the only place you can end up making an unrecoverable mistake. And I'm gonna say there are a lot of places you can make an unrecoverable mistake, but a lot of them, I mean, you can recover from many of them, but they can still be very costly. And so definitely take the right-of-way training. And you actually, like WSDOT keeps a list of who's taken the no right-of-way. And you have to submit that. If you don't have right-of-way, they keep that list. So even if you don't have right-of-way, you still have to have taken that training. So it's definitely important. And it's nice if you're at an agency that has right-of-way staff and you have, you have 3, 4, 5 staff that are right-of-way agents. Even if you just have one, that's great. Sometimes you don't have that, and now you have a consultant, or maybe you have a professional surveyor that's taking care of some of those needs for you. But right-of-way phase, it is a big deal. So
I'm kind of curious, any other questions? We come from all over, and we have a lot of different responsibilities in our day-to-day jobs, those of us who are on the call. So I just want to put a feeler out there and see if there's anything else, sort of maybe not directly, specific to the slides that you heard, but any other just general questions for Diane and Ruth. And I don't see any. And so I am going to surmise that everybody is just sort of blown away with what all is.
Why would you think that?
it's very simple. No, one should be blown away. No, it's a lot. It's complicated.
And we have, I guess I just want to put out there for everybody, the news, if the news is to be believed at all, there will be a very large federal infrastructure stimulus package coming down before the year is out. And back in 2009, that put a lot of money into local communities, and small jurisdictions got projects, but there's a lot of strings attached to these projects. So I just sort of put that out there, that we may find ourselves under the gun a little bit later this year to quickly select projects for funding. And if so, just be really careful about what you're picking to fund with federal funding.
And Sarah, I want to throw something in there on that exact same topic of a lot of infrastructure money coming out. Just about half of that bill is transportation related. The other half is other infrastructure. And sometimes you can tap into multiple agency funding, and that's where the IACC comes in again, the Interagency Coordinating Council. They're funding agencies, both federal and state, and they can help, especially the folks that are in our TPOs and smaller communities. They are a huge help. So if you are hoping that you can put together a project with multiple funding from this potential stimulus package, I would advise you visit their website and kind of keep track of what they're doing, because they will have all the scoop. I mean, between all the agencies, everybody is going to be represented that gets money out of that. So it's a good group to work with.
They typically meet in August. Am I remembering that right? Or
October.
October.
Usually it's the third week in October. In Wenatchee. It's always in Wenatchee. But you can have tech team meetings and conversations with them at any time. And if anyone's interested, I can share that information. It's through the State Department of Commerce. And Kathy Reed is the woman's name that coordinates all those, and very helpful group.
Well, we're going to, if it's okay with you all, we will send a copy of the slides, because you have so many really great links in your slides. In addition to the video, we'll send the slides to everybody, and we could include, we'll include without a link to the IACC website or whatever recommendation you would suggest, Ruth,
Okay.
just for people, so people have that.
Yes. I'll send you one, Thera, so you have it to add.
Perfect. Thank you.
And something, Sarah, that we had talked about also offline a little bit was, and we didn't include much in the presentation today, was the need for agencies, the federal funds that come down to the county, that so much has to be spent for rural, so much has to be spent for urban, it has to be obligated always by a certain date. And so we kind of touched on that pavers are fairly safe, but something that we should be looking out, even if you're doing pavers, we always did preservation with we did overlays when I was at Mason County with that funds, but you need to be looking at those roads and prepping crack sealing, any dig outs, anything that needs to be done for that. You kind of, like, I always just feel like on pavement preservation, you want to do some of that prep work ahead of time. You can have your contractor do it, but it works better if you're doing those things ahead of the year that it's paved. So you can do that with your maintenance crews and put it out. And that actually really helps you as well in scoping your projects earlier. Because now if you find, like, hey, we don't have any urban roads, but we have an urban boundary that comes right up to the right-of-way line of a road. And why isn't this road urban? Why is this road rural? When one side of it is urban, the other side is rural, and we don't have enough roads to spend our urban funds on. You can go through a process. You can get denied, but you can go through a process to ask to reclassify your road as well. So those are things, if you're looking out far enough ahead at what you've been getting for your urban and rural funds and how you're going to spend those, that can be really helpful to do certain things that do take time, so that you have a game plan looking out 3-4 years, and that your roads are prepped and that your plans are ready and that you can obligate without any issues, and that you're not going to end up paying back funds because you use the funds on the wrong type of road, on the wrong classification. You also, this is a more little known fact, but you can use federal funds on some of your lower level roads. It has to be arterials and collectors. You can't use it on the 9s and the 19s. There's new classification numbers as well. But then the local roads you cannot use it on, but there are certain collectors that you can use certain types of funds on, and you can use a percentage. I believe it's 10 or 15% of the money that you do get can be used on some of those lower classified collectors instead of the major collectors, on the minor collectors. That was part of the FAST Act, and it has not changed yet. So unless it changes in this infrastructure package.
But again, that's probably something people want to get some lead time on and get approval ahead of time. And don't think you're going to show up, drop an obligation package on Bob Berg's desk in the middle of July and get it obligated by August 1st, with sort of things like that still to be answered.
Yep.
Everything that we're hearing, August 1st is still a hard date for sanctions. So everybody, not just in the Peninsula region, but across the state, especially the small agencies, please try to get your projects in early. When sitting down, sort of prepping for training and talking with folks at local programs, it was clear that they weren't really clear on how long the local and regional processes take. If you require a STIP amendment, if if maybe your project isn't, maybe they find out NEPA is just not going to clear in time, and so your region needs to, or your county needs to select another project to go forward. There needs to be enough time for those decisions to be made for that project to then get into the hopper and go and make the August 1st obligation deadline. So really, we're encouraging folks to try to give it about 3 months if you can, because that gives time for them to get through it and for each agency to make any corrections that are needed and then get it back in time to be obligated, because it's not submitting it to local programs by August 1st that matters. It must be completely through the obligation approval process by August 1st.
And the other thing to think about that is that your agency, then if you have a CA, your agency is signing that, your mayor, your city administrator, your, someone, whoever's on your CA agreement is signing that as well. So that it takes time. Your own process time needs to be added in there as well.
And meanwhile, on the side, we will try to get some of these, we'll try to see if we can get a federal funding swap for some of these projects, but we're not there yet. So, hey, any last thoughts, Ruth and Diane, for all of us to keep in mind as we go out, or parting words?
I just thanks for everybody for showing up and being here, because I think the smaller agencies in particular, you wear a lot of hats. You have a lot going on and you have a lot of things to do. And this is important too. And, it's just, there's a lot. So thanks for the interest and for being here. So.
And if you think of other questions, go ahead and send them.
Yeah.
And we'll do our best to answer.
We'll definitely keep the lines of communication open. Thank you very, very much. And thank you everybody who took the time out of this beautiful afternoon to sign in. Good luck with your federal funding projects, and we'll see you around. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sarah.